Okay, well, here we are again, Coherence Horsemanship Institute welcoming Miss Jenny Trainor, who is a cohort and co-inspirer in the mastermind with Karen Rolfs for the Love of the Horse. Really amazing program. Jenny is a 3-star Pirelli instructor specializing in gaited horses of all things, and holds the acclaimed title of their lead instructor for gaited horses at the Pirelli campus in Ocala, Florida, which I never did get to go to, and I wish I had. To her credit, she has a lifetime of titles and experience. She holds 4 world championships on Tennessee walking horses under the tutelage, and I hope I say this right, Diane Guick?
Close, Diane Gack.
Gack, okay, sorry Diane. Okay. And competed at the Cowboy Dressage World Finals in the gaited horse division, and has mastered the flying lead change on her walking horses, which I know how difficult that is. So kudos to you. In 2020, Jenny took her 30 years of experience in the show arena and the equine world and launched her first online gaited horse course. And she also teaches clinics here in the United States for gaited and non-gaited horses using the Pirelli method and helping people and horses to have better relationships together. So welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Bo. I appreciate it.
I know that this is kind of an impromptu. I really wanted to interview you because I really think that for people to understand that there is a difference when they're working with their gaited horse versus a non-gaited horse, but most people don't know how to approach that. What are some of the things that they could do? And we can get into that. But other than what I have just shared with everyone, is there anything else about your past experience that you'd like to share with everyone?
You know, I think just wandering my way through the Pirelli program with a gaited horse was one of those things. I didn't really have anybody to coach me and help me go through it. And I managed to make my way through, but I didn't concentrate very much on my horse's gait. I knew it was there, and I messed with it here and there, but mostly I was trying to figure out Pirelli. And then, so what I did is I took all of my gaited horse knowledge and I shoved it in a little box somewhere in the back of my brain and said, I'm just going to leave that be and let that be what it is. And eventually I'll get back to it. And so I went through the Pirelli program and didn't focus on my horse's gait at all, hardly, other than I wanted him to be gaiting and not trotting. And I didn't really want him pacing. So I kind of accepted a myriad of, for the most part, garbage in between there, and just made my way through the program, trying to understand the psychology and the horsemanship and not focusing on what Pat would call a specialty. But now looking back, I know my horse would have been a little bit happier had I actually focused on some of those things, but I didn't know how at the time. And I didn't have anybody that could help me with how. And now I know how, and I want to help other people so that their horses don't get as frustrated as I'm sure my poor horse did.
So going through that then, was that kind of an impetus to figure out how to make that difference?
Yeah, it definitely was, because as I went through it, it always frustrated me because I thought, this horse is more talented than this. And one of the biggest things was thinking about his posture and his self-carriage, and being able to discuss with him what I wanted. And so most of the time he was going around very hollow with his head up in the air looking like a giraffe. And that isn't something that we want in Pirelli, but a lot of times it ends up happening because people don't, we focus on lots of other things. We focus on the relationship and all sorts of other aspects of that, but really talking to them about posture doesn't really come until we hit into the end of level 3 and beginning of level 4. And, I think there's just a lot of other things that we can talk to them about if we knew we could.
Sooner.
And so that's part of it. And I think we're, now as Linda's learning more and as we're learning more, we're beginning to think more about that. And it's not necessarily so much about posture as it is about emotions, and can we help them emotionally learn to relax and stretch and put their head down and that sort of thing. And we can add that in a lot more, and it helps our horses become relaxed much, much quicker.
So what you're saying then is, in actuality, if we know more, we can actually help the horse sooner so that they don't go through a quote unquote process of maybe being tossed to the side physically to gain the mental, whereas those things can happen simultaneously.
Exactly. And I think that that's one of the things, you know, Pat preaches a ton of. He says, the more you know about the finish, the better a job you'll do about the start. And I totally am sure that I botched that quote. But, you know, once you understand what the finish is supposed to look like, then when you start something or when you're starting a next horse, you learn way more. And sometimes, you know, you're not going to have as many horses as I've ridden throughout the years to be able to do that with. But that was part of me going through the Pirelli programs. I had to know what it looked like step by step. And then now that I've done it, I'm like, oh, if I'd added just one more thing, then it would have made my poor gaited horse so much happier if I just helped him in the beginning with that, rather than let him just be wrong for so long he thought he was right.
Yes. Well, and thank goodness that they're so pliable, and that they're so willing to work with us, and even when we've done that for so long, that they're able to relearn something that needed to be maybe at the forefront instead of at the end.
Oh yeah. And I think that, like, it's really amazing to me. David Lichtman, who he also does a lot with gaited horses in the Pirelli program, and he and I got the opportunity to teach together for that gaited horse course in Florida, and so it was super fun. And the funny thing is that we had video from my horse when he passed level 4, because I originally had to pass the old level 3 in order to become an instructor, and I didn't do that on my personal horse. I did it on a horse that I happened to have in training at the time. Because he was much better at things like flying lead changes. And then they, of course, Pirelli changed the system. And so then I had to do flying lead changes on my personal horse because I no longer had that horse that I had in training.
Oh, wow.
And so when you went back and you looked at my original level 4 with my personal horse, Classic, he was hollow, and he was basically doing like a little yucky gait, hollow in his back, head up in the air, not really walking, kind of racking between a rack and a walk. And then it was ugly. And I think that was in 2012, I think is when I passed that level 4 with him. And then it was, I think 2015 is when David and I got to teach together in Florida. And so David had seen him, and Carol Coppinger, which she's also a Pirelli instructor that had some gaited horse experience. So they'd seen him prior in that yucky, racky, head up, gross thing that he was doing. And then I took him with me to Florida. So basically 3 years later, because once I passed level 4, I was like, okay, I don't have to worry about flying lead changes anymore. I'm gonna focus on my horse's gait, because now I want to go back to that box that I'd put somewhere in the back, and I needed to open it up and pull things out and dust them off and make them look more natural than when I had used them prior to natural horsemanship, and figure out a way to use psychology to get some of those things done. So in doing so, in 3 years, and so in 2015, my horse would have been 15 years old. So from 2012 to 2015, I completely changed his way of going, because I thought about being more conscientious about his gait and his posture, and helping him to actually do what he needed to do, and how do I teach him that? And so that was a whole nother learning process. On top of it is, okay, now I've managed to get my Pirelli level 4 done. Now, how do I use all this information from pre-Pirelli and then what I have from Pirelli, and, you know, make that stuff look way more natural, because it wasn't.
Well, it couldn't have been. Yeah, right.
No, well, I mean, there were some things, because, you know, the good thing, like, I think about natural horsemanship is that anybody that's successful with horses has some piece of natural horsemanship. They may not have the whole system. Like Pirelli, I think, is just a really great model for that. But they may have a piece of it. You know, they may have friendly game, or they may have a really good ability to deal with respect, or whatever it is. And so those things that everybody has a little bit of, but not all of it. And so that was the thing, is that you just went, well, I happened to use a lot of draw reins back in the day. You know, things like that. There was mechanics, and I used a lot of mechanics. And so how do I not use the mechanics, and how do I use the psychology to teach them what I need them to know? And so that 3 years between 2012 and 2015 was a huge learning experience for me. And so David and Carol both saw the difference in my horse and went, holy cow, what have you been doing? And so that was part of that whole course. As I started, that's where I got to actually feel like I'd been given a little bit of rein to go ahead and teach what it is that I had been messing with.
Very
and I'd been secretly practicing on some of my students out in the field too. And then got to do that course, and it was super fun. And then just continued on with developing it a little bit more. And realistically, it's all natural horsemanship. It's just a matter of how you order things and what things you put on your priority, and like adding one more level of what am I going to release to. And that's probably one of the biggest things is what am I going to release to? Because when you have a non-gaited horse, it's really easy. You have walk, trot, canter. You might have gallop, and you could say that you have like Linda Pirelli will often say she's got like the chain gang trot versus a trot of some sort of quality, right? And so so you've got a couple things to choose from there, but not very many.
Not a lot, yeah.
When you look at a gaited horse, you have walk and you have canter, but you have all sorts of crazy forms of canter. You know, we can do things like crossfire like nobody's business. We can kind of pace on one side and kind of canter on the other, or pace gallop. That's David Lichtman likes to call it pace gallop.
Pace gallop.
It's hilarious. And then of course we have anywhere from a trot to a pace. So we have this thing called the gait scale, and on one end we have trot, and on one end we have pace. And there is a myriad of millions of things they can do in between trot and pace in lots of different combinations. And they can do things like trot behind and walk up front. That's this fancy thing called a foxtrot. And we have names for them. Well, we have some names that are good and some names no offense. And so that's the problem with gaited horse people, is that we make up these names for these gaits, and sometimes the same gait has multiple different names, especially when you come to different breeds. And so, somebody's going to call it a passo largo, and somebody else is going to call it a rack, and somebody else is going to, call it something else, an amble or a single foot. And it's
oh my goodness,
virtually the same. There's a lot of same gaits that happen in a lot of those. And, my favorite thing to do is go on Facebook. Well, I try not to do it very often, but is to go on the gaited horse Facebook groups, and they'll post a video of a horse. And they'll be like, what gait is my horse doing? And you'll see like 150 replies, and they'll be all sorts of different. It is hilarious. And so I find it to be quite amusing to watch the arguments that happen there. And so that's the thing that happens. You had, when you sent out the little questionnaire of things that you might possibly ask me, one of those was something or other about what is the biggest question that you ever get asked.
Yes.
And that question is, what gait is my horse doing? Because nobody happens to know. And the biggest thing that I can say to those people is, don't worry about what gait your horse is actually doing right now. It's more important to know which end of the scale he happens to be on, because we want to get him closer to center. So the closer to center he is, the closer to a smooth gait he is. And so the closer to center we get him, the better off we are. And who wants to label something that's garbage? It's just not helpful. So if you know if it's on the trotty end of the scale or on the pacey end of the scale, then you know which way you've got to go. And that's the most helpful thing, is not worrying about what it is actually called. Because the other thing that happens is that our horses will switch between gaits really, really quickly. So quickly that many times, like veterinarians or people will think that their horse is lame because the horse keeps switching gaits so fast that it looks like it's got a funny little hitch in its get along. And, or they'll do things like they'll canter behind and walk up front, or they'll canter up front and trot behind. I mean, they can do so many things. And so when you've got that many choices to choose from, it makes it way more difficult to release to something that you want in a gaited horse versus a trotting horse, because you have to be quicker as to going, oh, that's what it is. And unfortunately, most of our hindquarters, our personal hindquarters or butts, are not very well educated when it comes to feeling gaited horses. And so we know when it's smooth and we know when it's not smooth. And it's just now figuring out, okay, well, there's a whole bunch of miscellaneous in between, and what is it? And so really learning how to help people be able to see it from the ground is really helpful, because our eye is easier to train than our butt, apparently.
And I can see why, because of the part that's attached to the top of the body is a little bit thicker. So I have a question as you're talking about all these things, and that there's such a variety from one end of the spectrum to the other. What do you think, Jenny, is the cause that there are that many different answers to one question? What is the reason that the horse offers that many different things? They're not confused.
No. Well, they can just do whatever they want, and it doesn't matter to them if they're smooth or not, right? They don't care.
They don't care.
Right?
Well, you would think in some cases that they would learn what was more comfortable when that person's butt, quote unquote, wasn't very well trained.
Yes, I mean, you would think that would happen, right? But the problem is that we get in their way a lot, because somehow or another, one of like the biggest farces that somebody, and it happens, I think, in non-gaited horses too, that one of the biggest farces that people hear is that in order to get a gaited horse to be smooth, you have to collect him. Okay. Well, and what most people do is they just yank their face in and put a bigger bit on him and hope that goes well. But it doesn't really work. So because again, what happens is then they just kind of accordion up and they get really hollow, and then they get tense in their back. And so what happens with tenseness in a gaited horse is that when they get tense and when they get stiff, most of the time what happens is they'll pace, especially if they're more on that pacey side of the spectrum. So because it's basically a genetic mutation. They're going to call it a mutation when they've looked at the DNA of gaited horses. And so they call it, called the gatekeeper gene. And you can look it up. And it basically is a sequence that allows a gaited horse to have the ability to pace, which is both legs on the same side moving at the same time versus a diagonal.
Like a giraffe.
Like a giraffe. And you see other animals doing it as well. Like I have a German Wirehair pointer, and a lot of times you'll see him pace as well. And the funniest thing that I ever saw was I was at a dressage competition. Pat had decided that he was going to send us all to assist at a dressage show. And, we did things like, run information from ring to ring and, check numbers as they were going in the rings and stuff. And so I'm standing at one arena at the outgate, and I could, because dressage shows are nice and quiet, right? And I couldn't help myself. I was like, oh my God, would you look at that dressage horse pace? That is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And I about got like attacked from all sides. They're like, oh, that's horrible. Well, yeah, it is. But the cool thing is somehow or another, they'd managed to put enough tension in that horse that he managed to pace. And so I was like, oh, that's terrible. But that's where, Mother Nature allowed them. And so what happens is they can do a diagonal and they can do a pace or a lateral. And so then miscellaneous things happen in between that are all sorts of crazy. And that's where like they picked up different breeds, or somebody couldn't manage to figure out how to get a Missouri Foxtrotter to walk anymore like a walking horse, even though most of his background is Tennessee walking horses, even still on their pedigrees are Tennessee walking horses. And they just made up a new breed because they were doing this Foxtrot thing. And so they just called it a new deal, right?
So it's not literally what you're saying then, Jenny, it's not a state of mind that causes that many variations, or is it?
It can be. a state of mind of the horse, because if they're tight and tense, then a lot of times you'll get a pace. Granted, if they're more on the trotty side of things, then you may just get a tight, tense trot as well. But if they're, because they have this ability to pace, these horses, and when they do that tight, tense pace, it's literally really painful to ride. And you know, they can pace and be well, especially if they're a relaxed horse. So there is a state of mind for the horse, but it's more about teaching them which one you want. And so it's kind of like when you've asked your horse to trot and he breaks into a canter, or he breaks down to a walk. And so you just have to tell him that that's not what you wanted, right? And there's a myriad of ways that you can tell him that that's not what you want, you know, from kicking him to gigging it, to reefing on his face, right? There's all sorts of ways that you can do that. There's lots nicer ways to do that too, like bringing up your energy to go, or like lifting up one rein and bending him to a stop, right? Or bending him down so he quits cantering. And
So,
so
you're talking about building a language then, which is what we're all doing out there in the horse world, correct?
exactly. You just have to be, with the gaited horses, you have to be a little bit more particular because there's more to choose from rather than walk, trot, canter.
So it's a smorgasbord.
There's a smorgasbord, and there's a lot of crap. And so there's a lot of yucky stuff in there.
So I think too, though, you're saying that, Jenny, from 30 plus years of experience with gaited horses, and when you look at somebody who maybe purchased a gaited horse because they heard that they were really easy to ride because they're so smooth, they have no clue that there's 15 different kinds of something between a trot and a pace.
Exactly.
So building that language might be a little bit more complicated, and thus they need to come find somebody like you that understands how to do that.
Yeah. And, you know, really in the beginning, I just tell people, do you like the gait that you have or do you not like it? Because if you don't like it, let's do something about that. And then I give them some tools that help them with that. Like the biggest thing is just put a bend in them. And it doesn't have to be a very big bend. It's amazing. And, you know, just lift one rein. And a lot of it also has to do with impulsion, because most of the time what happens is that you're right. People get a gaited horse because they've heard they're easy to ride and they're smooth and they have really good personalities. Well, the key there is that a lot of times gaited horses, because of that lateral, have a really hard time cantering, which in all actuality also means they have this tendency, if they don't canter well, they also don't buck well, okay? Which means that people don't get bucked off of them as much as a non-gaited horse. Now, it does not mean that they're not going to fall off because the horse spun them off, because they can spin around really fast and easy. And so tons of people will say, oh, I got bucked off my gaited horse. And I'm like, really? Have you ever seen him buck? And it doesn't mean they can't. Like I have a horse here that can buck pretty good, but he also canters very well. So if he canters very well, then he can probably buck pretty well, because cantering and bucking, the only difference is where's the weight. Cantering, weight hindquarters. Bucking, weight forequarters, right? So so that's where, you know, they come to find, they're like, oh, well, they're so easy to ride because they don't tend to get bucked off so much. But that doesn't mean that the horse is emotionally stable. Right. And so, so what happens is people get away with a lot more on a gaited horse because they're not afraid, or the likelihood of them getting bucked off is much less. And so that's where a lot of that comes from, but they don't necessarily take care of the emotional state of that horse. And that's where natural horsemanship is so beautiful and comes in and takes care. I think about taking care of the impulsion problems and the worry in the horses and getting them relaxed. And a lot of that is going to take care of tons of your gaiting issues, because if your horse isn't relaxed, getting a decent gait is incredibly difficult. Plus, if you're having to like hold him back the whole time, you're not going to be able to get hardly anything done, because you can't talk about anything when you're just reefing on his face.
So can you touch back on at the beginning of our conversation, you said that from 2012 to 2015, you kind of went back to that little golden box that was hidden in the closet, took everything out, reordered it, put a new tint on it so that it had a fashion of partnership in it. And then you rebuilt your horse at you said how old? 15 years old?
So it was 12 is
Oh,
when
he
I
was,
finally, when I started that whole process. And so when everybody saw him again,
oh, he
and
was 15
he
years
was
old.
15. And so I did, and and it didn't necessarily take 3 years. The other thing that you have to realize is I had 2 toddlers because I have 2 small children
Oh my
at
goodness.
that same time. So, so this was one of those rebuilds, and it's not like he's my only horse either, but I went through and reworked him.
So in that rework, that's what I wanted to bring you back to, is that you said taking him from hollow backed head up, not relaxed horse, obviously, to a horse using his spine correctly, using his whole body correctly. Can you just kind of touch 3 things that you did that made that difference that you think just kind of stood out?
I think the biggest thing was looking back and going, okay, well, what is it that changes gait? So when I was in a clinic, a couple of years prior to that, before I became an instructor, I had done a clinic with a gentleman named Dave Ellis, and also a Pirelli instructor. And so he had us yielding the hindquarters on a circle. And what I noticed when I yield the hindquarters on a circle was that, by golly, my horse quit pacing, and all of a sudden he started walking.
Oh, there's that bend again.
Bend again. How interesting, right? And so I saw that on the ground. I went, And so I did it again, and lo and behold, it happened again. And so I just kind of kept playing with that. Then the other thing that I did, so that was really important. Then the other thing that I did was learning how to get my horse to put his head down. And so for a while, it was physical. Like, how can I teach you so we did bit isolations. How can I teach you to put your head down when I pick up the reins, right? And to stretch. And in Pirelli, we did this thing for a long time that we called fluid rein, which helped our horses learn to stretch down. So that was really important. But then when I could add those 2 things together, yes, and play with that a little bit, where they would go, okay, I can bend and stretch down. Then I realized that, I have these things called legs. And lo and behold, horses are a leg game. And the unfortunate thing about gaited horse people, so I'm going to tell on us a little bit, is that we don't do very much with our legs, which is kind of hilarious. And so through the Pirelli program, that's one of the things that we start to learn a lot about, is our leg positions, as well as our rein positions. Like, what are the leg positions that go with that? And it took me a long time to really kind of understand that I could actually affect where his head was based on what I did with my legs. And if I released at the right time, when he put his head down, or when he was gaiting well, that he would start to go, that's what you want. And so releasing at the right time was one of the biggest as well. So first off, put a bend in them. Second one is get their head down. And it doesn't really even matter what order you do this in, right? And then being able to utilize my legs, so that it wasn't necessarily so much about my hands. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to use my reins, but the more you use your reins, the less they use their brains. So if I can do that and then release at the right time, then my horse starts to put effort into what it is that I'm actually after. And so that. Honestly, I think those are like the biggest things. And lots of people have influenced me since that first clinic, or it wasn't my first clinic, but since that day that I realized that with Dave Ellis. And it probably was something that I'd learned a little bit earlier on as well. My original Pirelli instructor had taught me to use one rein to bend them when they break gait. And so funnily enough, if you just do that when they break from a gait that you don't want to a gait that you do want, then if you release at the right time, then you get the gait that you want. It's just like if they break into a canter, you put a little bend in them until they come back to a trot, right? Well, if I went to a pace, I put a little bend in them until they quit pacing, and then let the rein go. So so that was kind of the original thing, but nobody really organized it for me so that I could understand that. And now it's easy, and I just run people through some basic exercises so that they have some tools, whether or not they're a Pirelli student or not. If I can teach them some basic rein positions and some basic leg positions and when to release, then it just starts to fall together. And that's the beauty.
And both for the horse and the person.
Oh yeah.
Oh, well, that's a wealth of knowledge and a lot of information for people to chew on. I would love for you to let us know. I know you have your online course. And if you would send me the link for that so that we can embed that into the interview, that would be great. Otherwise, how do people get a hold of you? They want to come to a workshop or a clinic you're doing. They want to contact you for maybe one-on-one time coaching or whatever that might be. How do they do that?
Well, obviously my website's great. And so that's just jennytrainor.com, and it's Trainor with an OR at the end. So it's kind of like horse trainer, except for just a little different. And, and the funny part is that I married that into that name after I was already a Pirelli instructor. Oh goodness. So anyway,
yeah, that's good.
So it's kind of funny. You can find, obviously I'm on the Pirelli website. And I think it's actually still got my hyphenated name on there, which is Jenny Calkins Trainer. But I've pretty much given up the Calkins part of it and just gone with the married name. And then, but you can always find me there, or on my email address is jenny.trainer@yahoo.com. So that's easy too. And find me on Facebook. But if you get on my website, there's a way to go ahead and fill out your information so that I can contact you when I have things going on. Granted, I don't do a ton of emails. So if you're afraid of getting emails every week, it's not going to happen.
You don't have to worry about that. You're too busy for that.
I got too much going on for that. You know, it'll happen when I release something, or, you know, once or twice a year, maybe if you're lucky. But mostly, you know, filling out, you know, your area where you're at, or if you want something, but contacting me by Facebook or email is probably the best way.
Where do you post, let's say you're going to be in, I know you were in Washington State not too long ago, in Spokane area. Where does, other than the Pirelli site, do you post that on your website so people know that you're going to be in an area at a certain date during the year?
Yeah. Yes, usually I do. This year, of course, because of
this year's
world craziness, my website has not been correct at all because I keep having to move clinics or change dates and things. But yes, usually it's on my website as to where I'm going to be. Also, I have a Facebook page, a professional Facebook page, and so a lot of times they'll be on there as well. And various things. It depends on how full the clinic is, if it's how much I actually advertise it, just because if it's already full, then it seems silly to actually advertise.
Well, so do you have auditor spaces then at those clinics that people can
Yes, and auditors, you know, auditors get a great seat. It's amazing to me, but you can't, like, they usually an auditor's ticket is very cheap, right? Because otherwise you can't get people to come. But realistically, they probably get the most information out of the entire clinic because they're not having to deal with their horse. And so they get to see all of the different riders. So that's a great way to go.
If they bring a notebook and a pen, they'll retain even more of that than most people do.
I know. And as long as they can stay awake, that's the other thing. Because half the time they're like, oh my God, are they done with this exercise? But, you know, it takes a while sometimes to get the exercise done or whatever it is. But yeah, auditors, that's an underestimated wealth of knowledge that one can get from almost any clinic, is the auditor seat.
Absolutely, I agree.
So,
well, thank you so much. I know you're really busy. I really appreciate you taking time and chit-chatting with me, and I can't wait to see this interview up on the site, which soft launches on the 17th of this month, and then Labor Day the 7th, we're actually going to pop a baby out and send it into orbit. So
awesome. That'll be so much fun. Well, hopefully, my mom always told me that I had an immense amount of verbal diarrhea. So hopefully I didn't explode too much all over you.
Well, you know, when you have a wealth of information and you want to share it and your heart's definitely in it, it just comes out. That's great. So thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Sounds great.
Okay.
Good talking with you.
Bye-bye.